My father-in-law brought me to the boardroom to watch me fail. I didn't realize that until I was already sitting at the table, surrounded by men in suits who had known each other for 30 years, and he leaned over and said, "Loud enough for the room to hear. Tell them what you do, sweetheart. Remind us why you're here." He was smiling when he said it. That warm politician's smile he'd perfected over 4 decades in federal politics. The kind of smile that made people feel chosen right before he cut them down. I'd been married to his son for 3 years by then. 3 years of Sunday dinners where my contributions to the conversation were politely redirected. 3 years of his wife asking, in that particular way she had, whether I'd thought about doing something more stable. 3 years of my father-in-law, Senator Douglas Whitmore, 4 terms, decorated public servant, face of Canadian institutional integrity, treating me like a problem his son had brought home and not yet solved. But that evening in the boardroom on the 42nd floor overlooking the Ottawa River, I finally understood that he hadn't brought me there as family. He'd brought me there as a prop. Let me back up, because you need to understand who I am before you understand what happened that night. My name is Avery. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, in a house that backed onto the Canadian Shield. My mother worked nights at the hospital. My father drove long haul and was home maybe 12 weekends a year. I learned early that no one was coming to hand you anything. You built what you needed or you did without. I put myself through Carleton, economics and public policy, which my father-in-law once described, at a Christmas dinner, as the kind of degree people get when they can't decide what they actually want to study. I smiled and passed him the gravy boat and said nothing. I was good at saying nothing when it counted. What I didn't tell him, what I'd never told anyone in that family, was what I did after Carleton. I went to work for the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, federal regulator. Not glamorous. Windowless office in a building on Kent Street that most people walked past without knowing what happened inside. But what happened inside was that we watched the banks, we watched the investment firms, we watched the people who moved money in Canada and made sure they did it within the lines. I was good at it, better than good. And then I met my husband at a friend's wedding in Gatineau, and I fell in love with him. The way you fall in love when you're 28 and you've been working too hard for too long, and someone looks at you like you're the most interesting person in the room. He was kind. He was funny. He had his father's jaw and none of his father's cruelty, which I did not yet understand was its complicated thing to navigate. His father was charming at first. They always are. The contempt came in slowly, the way cold comes into a house in November. You don't notice it until you're already shivering. It started with questions about my job that weren't really questions. Must be very exciting, all those spreadsheets. Then observations about our apartment. You know, when my son was your age, he already had a house. Of course, different circumstances. Then, eventually, the comments in front of other people. Avery works for the government. You know the type. Safe pension, home by 5. Never quite sure what they actually accomplish. My husband would put his hand on my knee under the table. I would smile. I became very skilled at smiling. What his father didn't know, what no one in that family knew, was that for the previous 14 months, I had been part of a joint task force, OSFI in partnership with the RCMP Financial Crime Unit. We weren't watching banks anymore. We were watching a specific network of investment vehicles that had been quietly siphoning money from public pension funds. Not loudly, not obviously. The kind of fraud that takes years to see if you know exactly where to look, and forever if you don't. I knew exactly where to look. The senator found out about the task force 3 weeks before that boardroom dinner. I know that now. I didn't know it then. What I knew then was that he called my husband on a Thursday afternoon and said he wanted us to come to a dinner. An informal gathering of some colleagues, he said, people he respected, people he wanted his son to know better. He mentioned it would be good for the family to spend more time together. He didn't mention that 2 of the men at that dinner table were under active investigation. We arrived at the building at 7. The lobby was the kind that makes you feel underdressed even in your best clothes. Marble floors. A security desk staffed by a man who checked names against a list. The senator was already there when we stepped off the elevator, and he took my husband's hand and shook it and clapped him on the shoulder. And then he looked at me and said, "Avery, you came," as if he'd half expected I wouldn't. The other men were already seated. I recognized 2 of them from photographs I was not supposed to have seen. I kept my face neutral. I'd learned to keep my face very neutral. We sat down. There was food, good food, the kind that gets ordered in for these kinds of evenings. Someone poured wine. The conversation moved the way. Conversation moves at those tables. Policy, real estate, a federal procurement contract that had apparently just been awarded to someone's brother-in-law. Some shared amusement at a minister who'd made a gaffe in QP that week. I mostly listened. I asked one question about municipal zoning in Ottawa that apparently struck several of them as charmingly out of place. There was laughter. And then my father-in-law set down his glass and said, "You know, I've always found it interesting, the OSFI. What is it you people actually do all day?" It was said pleasantly. It was always said pleasantly. I looked at him. "We supervise federally regulated financial institutions," I said. "Banks, insurance companies, pension funds. We make sure they're operating within the law." "Pension funds," one of the other men repeated. He said it a certain way, not a question, not nothing, a certain way. My father-in-law smiled. "Sounds like a lot of paper pushing. I imagine the real work happens elsewhere." He glanced around the table. "No offense to our Avery, of course. Someone has to mind the filing." There was laughter, polite, comfortable, the kind you make when the most powerful man in the room makes a joke. My husband's hand found mine under the table. I let him hold it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I moved my hand to pick up my water glass. I looked at my father-in-law and I said, "You're right that a lot of it is paper, 14 months of it, in my case." Something shifted in his expression. "Almost nothing, almost." "The work I've been on," I said, and my voice was very calm. The way it gets calm when something important is happening, involves cross-referencing transaction records across about 40 separate entities, numbered companies, mostly, registered in Alberta, a few in Ontario. The kind of structure that looks like nothing if you're only looking at one piece of it. Silence had settled over the table. "It's actually quite beautiful," I said. "The way it was built, whoever designed it understood that regulators have jurisdictional limits. If you spread the exposure thin enough across enough entities, nobody sees the whole picture." I paused. "Except that we were looking for exactly that pattern. So we did see it." My father-in-law's smile had not changed. He was very good, but his left hand had moved to his water glass, and he was holding it the way people hold things when they need something to hold. "What a fascinating hobby," he said. "You must be very dedicated." "It's not a hobby," I said. "It's a joint investigation, OSFI and the RCMP Financial Crime Unit. We've been building the file for 14 months. I set my own glass down. "I'm actually not supposed to discuss it at dinner parties." I apologized for bringing it up, and then I picked up my fork and went back to my food. One spoke for a moment. Then someone asked about the hockey, and the conversation moved, the way conversations do when they need to go somewhere else, quickly. My father-in-law watched me for the rest of the evening, not openly. He was too practiced for that. But I felt it. We left at 10. In the elevator on the way down, my husband squeezed my hand and said, "What was that? What was what?" I said, "Avery, I'm not allowed to talk about ongoing investigations," I said. "You know that." He looked at me for a long moment. He had his father's jaw and none of his father's cruelty, but he was also his father's son, and there were things about the family I don't think he'd ever let himself fully see. I think that night in the elevator, he started to see them. "I need to tell you about a woman named Janet." Janet Moreau was 63 years old. She'd spent 31 years working for a regional transit authority in Northern Ontario. She'd paid into her pension every single paycheck, the way you do when you trust the system. The way you do when you build a life around the assumption that the rules apply to everyone. When her pension fund collapsed. Not all of it, not in a way that made the news, just enough, just quietly enough. She lost 40% of what she'd been counting on. She was 2 years from retirement. She took a job at a grocery store. She told her daughter it wasn't so bad. She was the kind of woman who says it isn't so bad. I found Janet's name in the beneficiary records 14 months into the investigation. Her name was one of hundreds. But it was the first name I looked up when I needed to remember why we were doing it. I thought about Janet on the drive home from that dinner. My husband was quiet. The city lights moved past the windows. The Ottawa River was dark on our left. I thought about the man who had designed the fund structure we'd been tracing for over a year, who had known exactly how to use numbered companies, how to move money in ways that exhausted jurisdictional attention, who had connections inside the regulatory process, deep enough to have heard, 3 weeks ago, that a joint task force was closing in. I thought about my father-in-law's hand on his water glass. I thought about 14 months of paper. The call came on a Tuesday morning. 6 weeks later, I was at my desk on Kent Street when my supervisor came in and closed the door. She sat down. She said, "We have a problem." Someone had leaked the scope of the investigation, not the specific targets. Those were protected, but enough that a lawyer representing one of the numbered companies had filed a motion that was going to complicate the timeline significantly. Our case wasn't compromised. But our window was closing faster than we'd planned. She looked at me and said, "The leak came from somewhere close." I thought about a dinner party on the 42nd floor. I thought about what it meant to have access to the right people. I said, "How close do we think?" She said, "Close enough that we need to accelerate. The RCMP wants to move on the primary entities by end of month." I said, "Then, let's move." I won't pretend I was calm about it. I drove home that night and sat in our kitchen for a long time after my husband went to sleep. I thought about what it would mean, what it would cost. My father-in-law called the next morning. He said he'd been thinking about dinner, about our conversation, and that he hoped I understood he was only ever trying to be collegial. He said family meant everything to him. He said he hoped I knew I was part of his family. I said, "Of course, thank you for calling." He said, "I've always admired people in public service, the dedication it takes." Truly, I said, "It does take dedication and discretion," he said. There was pause that lasted just a half second too long. I said, "Absolutely. We take discretion very seriously." After I hung up, I sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I called my supervisor and told her about the dinner, all of it, in detail. The way you do when you understand that what felt like a family conflict has become something else entirely. She was quiet when I finished. Then she said, "You should have told me sooner." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. Are you prepared for what happens next?" I thought about Janet Moreau working at a grocery store at 63 years old. I thought about hundreds of names in a beneficiary file. I thought about 14 months of paper. And the woman who'd sat in a windowless office reading transaction records until she could see the whole picture. "Yes," I said, "I'm prepared." What happened next is still partially under a publication ban, so I'll tell you what I can. The warrants were executed on a Thursday, 14 entities simultaneously, as required by the structure of the case. The RCMP Financial Crime Unit is very good at simultaneous execution. You have to be, because if one entity hears before the others, documents move fast. My father-in-law was not one of the primary targets. I want to be accurate about that. He was a related party. The relationship between the numbered companies and his financial interests was documented but indirect. The The kind of thing that matters enormously to investors and is very easy for a good lawyer to complicate in court. What was not complicated was the evidence that someone with access to a specific briefing document had shared information externally in the weeks before the warrants were issued. That investigation, the secondary investigation, the leak investigation, took 4 months. It was conducted separately by people who had no connection to my file or to me. My father-in-law resigned from the Senate in February. He cited health reasons. He was 67 years old and had 4 terms behind him, and a lot of friends in a lot of rooms, and the statement his office released was carefully worded and mentioned his love of public service and his gratitude to Canadians. My husband read the statement at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you know?" I said, "I suspected." He said, "When?" I said, "At the dinner." When he held his water glass, he was quiet again. Outside our kitchen window, the street was covered in the kind of February snow that comes in sideways. Someone's dog was running through it with absolute joy, the way dogs do, completely unconcerned with everything that had led to this moment. My husband said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you're his son," I said, "and I needed you to be that for as long as you could be." He looked at me then, really looked at me. I think he was seeing for the first time the full shape of the last 3 years. What I'd been doing, who I was, what I'd held and held back and waited to understand before I acted. He said, "What's your case number?" "At OSFI. What do they call you?" It was a strange question. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You know, in the office, do you have a..." He stopped. "The other guys in your unit." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "They call me Moreau's Law." He didn't understand the reference. I explained about Janet, about the beneficiary file, about the name I'd pulled when I needed to remember why it mattered. He listened to the whole thing without saying anything. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think I've spent 3 years being embarrassed by the wrong person." The Senate Ethics Commissioner released a report in April. It was 37 pages. It was not a gentle document. The related party financial relationships it described, the indirect connections between my father-in-law's personal investment vehicles and several of the entities named in the primary investigation, were not sufficient to constitute criminal conduct under the existing framework. I want to be clear about that, because it matters that I'm accurate. He was not charged. His lawyers were very good, and the indirection was real, and the law is what it is. But the report was public, 37 pages, available on the Ethics Commissioner's website. As these things are in Canada, because transparency matters, and the public has a right to know. His 4-term legacy as a decorated public servant became, in that spring, a document that people read and discussed and wrote about. His name became a reference point in conversations about accountability and the gaps in federal financial oversight that the investigation had exposed. He called my husband once, in March before the report came out. My husband told me about it afterward. He said his father had said that he hoped we understood, that this had all been very difficult, that he'd made some decisions he wasn't proud of, that he hoped there wouldn't be lasting damage to the family. My husband told me he'd said, "Dad, you should have thought about that at dinner." His father had said he didn't know what dinner he was referring to. My husband had said, "The one where you brought my wife to the table to make her feel small." His father had said that wasn't how he remembered it. My husband had said, "I know. I used to not remember it that way either." The pension fund recovery process is ongoing. These things take years. The legal frameworks for restitution in cases like this move slowly, which is a real failure, and one I think about often. Janet Moreau is still working at the grocery store. I don't know her. I've never met her. She doesn't know I know her name. But I think about the 31 years she paid into the system trusting it would be there. I think about all the people like her who build their lives on the assumption that someone, somewhere is paying attention. I was paying attention. It's not a comfortable thing to be. I'll tell you that. It's not the kind of job that comes with a lot of outside recognition. You sit in a windowless office on Kent Street, and you read transaction records, and you wait until you can see the whole picture. You go to dinner parties, and you hold your smile in place. And you say nothing until saying nothing is no longer the right choice. You make calls you weren't ready and you accept that some costs don't have clean resolutions. My father-in-law moved to his cottage in the Muskokas after the report came out. I'm told he golfs. I don't wish him harm. I want to say that clearly. What I wanted was never for him to suffer. It was for the people he'd allowed to be harmed to have someone fighting on their side. My husband and I are still married. That surprises people sometimes when I tell the story. They expect a cleaner ending, maybe. Some dramatic break. But the truth is more ordinary than that. We are two people who had to look at each other very honestly and decide what we were made of. We're still deciding. The way everyone is. Last September, we drove up to Killarney Provincial Park for a long weekend. We hiked the La Cloche Silhouette Trail. Just a portion of it. Enough to see the quartzite ridges turn pink in the evening light. My husband made terrible coffee on a camp stove, and we sat on a flat rock above a lake and watched the sky do what the sky does up there, which is something that no boardroom on the 42nd floor has ever managed to replicate. He said, "I'm sorry he made you feel like nothing." I said, "He didn't, actually. That's the thing. He tried. But I knew what I knew, and that's a hard thing to take from a person." The light on the water was very still. He said, "Moreau's Law." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I want to know what that means to you." Really? I thought about it for a while. The quartzite was warm under my hands from the afternoon sun, still holding the heat even as the air cooled. I said, "It means you don't look away from the names. You don't let it become abstract. You find the person who paid in and got nothing back, and you keep her name in your head, and you work until the whole picture is clear, and then you do what the picture requires." He was quiet. I said, "That's all. It's not complicated." He said, "No, I think it's the least complicated thing about you." I thought about a man who'd put his hand on his water glass in a boardroom and believed that power and connection were armor enough against the truth. I thought about what it costs to sit at a table where someone is trying to make you feel small and hold everything you know completely still and wait. The lake was dark by the time we walked back to the campsite. Somewhere across the water, a loon called once and then went quiet. I have spent my whole career being the kind of person that certain kinds of men do not take seriously until it is far too late. I have never once minded.